Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I spoke to the leader of a lay organization for people who follow the Lotus Sutra teaching.
Oh?
They had some very fascinating perspectives on the Buddha Dharma. They spoke about the primordial cosmic Buddha, universal Buddhahood, and even the hierarchy of the teachings.
That is fascinating. Why did they decide to organize as lay people and not get more involved with a temple or a monastery?
A good question. I think it was because they are very active in politics and in charitable and humanitarian groups. Moreover, I think they don't want to leave their family and friends to pursue the difficult path of monkhood when they can study and discuss the sutras as lay people. While their inspiration is Buddhist, it seems their goals are largely worldly.
Interesting. I can understand how leaving the world, as the Buddha encourages us to do, cannot be done by everyone, but that shouldn't prevent them from being able to study and discuss the sermons. It also makes sense that they're active in those realms, because what good is the Buddha's Dharma if it's not applied in the real world and lived by everyone?
Agreed.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing the notable Japanese Buddhist organization, Risshō Kōsei Kai. Shout out to our listener John for asking, what is Risshō Kōsei Kai? What are its doctrinal roots? What are its historical origins?
What is Risshō Kōsei Kai?
Risshō Kōsei Kai is a Japanese new religious movement, or NRM as we'll be calling them, that was founded in 1938 by a man named Nikkyo Niwano and a lady named Myoko Naganuma. They were members of an older new religious group called Rei-yukai, which was strongly influenced by Nichiren Buddhism. Both Rei-yukai and Risshō Kōsei Kai venerate the Lotus Sutra as the highest object of worship, and they both have ancestor worship rituals. However, Rei-yukai was thought by the founders of Risshō Kōsei Kai to have fallen from proper worship and veneration. The story goes that the founders allegedly overheard a conversation among high-level leadership at Rei-yukai where this leadership said that going around and giving lectures on the teachings of the Lotus Sutra and reciting it were obsolete and outdated practices. So, Risshō Kōsei Kai was founded in response to that because the founders didn't agree with that sentiment. The name, Risshō Kōsei Kai, translates to something like Organization for the Establishment of the Beautiful Teaching, which points at one of its core goals, to propagate the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. The movement grew a great deal in the late 30s and early 40s, and eventually became a lay auxiliary organization of Nichiren-shu, one of the two primary sects of Japanese Nichiren Buddhism. Nichiren Shoshu is the other. These two sects splintered over succession issues. Nichiren Shoshu believes that Nichiren named a single successor, named Nikko Shonin. Conversely, Nichiren Shu instead believes each of Nichiren's 5 disciples are all part of the correct lineage. Nichiren Shoshu has come up on the show before in episode 66, as the sect that expelled Soka Gakkai as a Nichiren lay organization in the 1990s. We didn't talk about it much then, but the reason that they did this was because Nichiren Shoshu rejects all form of interfaith activity and regards any doctrine not given by Nichiren himself to be heretical and slanderous. Nichiren Shu was far more inclusive, far more accepting of interfaith activity, and far more supportive of the various interpretations of the Lotus Sutra that exist in the world. Risshō Kōsei Kai was affiliated with Nichiren Shu for a time, but Niwano felt that the sect was far too liberal in their religious and political activity, so he ended their relationship in 1950. Now, just because Risshō Kōsei Kai viewed itself as being more conservative than Nichiren Shu does not mean that it was as conservative as the fundamentalist Nichiren Shoshu. They didn't believe that everything besides their own teaching was a false teaching, and they didn't seek to defeat alternative doctrines and perspectives like Nichiren Shoshu does. They've been very active with regards to interfaith activity, humanitarian activity and aid all over the world, and pro-peace and anti-war movements. They assert the supremacy of the Lotus Sutra teaching and advocate for its adoption as political policy, but they don't regard all other religions as slanderous, false, or harmful in some way.
What are Risshō Kōsei Kai's doctrinal roots?
We've talked a great deal about how Nichiren himself was very interested in social revolution and reform, and that he and others believed that the Lotus Sutra advocated for social reform based on the principles of the text, such as the Ekayana, universal Buddhahood, and the role of the ruler or emperor as a propagator of the teaching, and more. Risshō Kōsei Kai is one of the many organizations that have appeared in history that are centered around the Lotus Sutra and their own interpretation of it. These organizations are usually politically active due to the fact that the text is so concerned with how it ought to be used, interpreted, and applied by rulers and emperors, and just by practitioners in the world in general. Sometimes they are also very active with charitable and humanitarian organizations, as is the case with Risshō Kōsei Kai and Soka Gakkai, because of course, one of the core doctrines of the Lotus Sutra and Buddhism at large being compassion and loving kindness. So, what is Risshō Kōsei Kai's actual interpretation of the Lotus Sutra that sets it apart from other groups? One of the most important points they emphasize from the sutra is the teaching of the eternal cosmic primordial Buddha. We learned about this when we read about it in chapters 15 and 16 of the Lotus Sutra. As we mentioned then, these chapters were some of the most controversial in the whole text because they claimed that the Buddha was not born as an unenlightened person, only to become enlightened later in his life. Furthermore, they claim that he did not die and enter parinirvana. He just demonstrated himself as doing all of these things as a skillful means to encourage and instruct sentient beings. In truth, he was a fully enlightened manifestation of the cosmic primordial Buddha from the start, who was enlightened innumerable eons ago. The implications of this are that the Buddha has a near infinite lifespan and that the entire Buddhist canon up to that point was a skillful means given to people who could not handle or understand the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and that fully enlightened beings can sneakily arise in the world as hidden Buddhas or Bodhisattvas with the purpose of teaching people and leading them to enlightenment. Another point they emphasize, which is related to the previous point, is the teaching of the Ekayana, the Buddha vehicle. We have established that the Lotus Sutra understands all of the Buddhist canon up to that point as being skillful means, and so that opens up the question of how we ought to understand the other three vehicles of Buddhism. What is the status of the Theravada path of the Arhat, the Mahayana path of the Bodhisattva, or the path of the solitary or Pratyeka Buddhas? The Lotus Sutra says that these are all teachings that are catered to the capacities of the people who follow them. In other words, they may seem as three different paths of pursuit of the Dharma, but they are all subsumed under the Buddha vehicle. They are presented as discrete and categorical because that's how the Buddha teaches people who understand the world in discrete categorical terms. But these paths are actually all the same, and they have the sole purpose of achieving Buddhahood in the future. Now, although they are all subsumed by the Buddha vehicle, there is still a hierarchy of teachings. The path that is closest to the truth, you might say the capital T truth, the Buddha vehicle, is the Bodhisattva path. The next closest path is the Pratyeka Buddha path, and the farthest is the Arhat path. They also all emphasize the teaching of chapter 12, the Devadatta chapter, which argues that the possibility of full Buddhahood is universal, extending to non-humans, women, children, and dire criminals like Devadatta. This serves as one of the foundations for loving kindness and compassion and the organization's activity in charitable and humanitarian organizations. You should always treat others with compassion because all beings have Buddha nature, and that nature should be respected, venerated, and nurtured. Another foundation for compassion and loving kindness is the fact that the true Bodhisattva ideal is to act compassionately without selfish desire for rewards, either earthly or heavenly. The argument is that there is no need for a reason to be nice. If the only reason you go around being nice is because you expect something good to come to you as a result, then the argument is that you've missed the point. Finally, they also believe in the practice of chanting the title of the sutra, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Nichiren, believing that the Lotus Sutra contained the totality of the Buddha Dharma, regarded each and every single letter of the text as a Buddha in itself. Each and every letter is a manifestation of the eternal and primordial Buddha seeking to teach us through the text. Thus, each letter by itself invokes the core teaching of the text. The Lotus Sutra itself argues that this is the case, stating that the Lotus Sutra teaching is the most complete teaching and that anybody who recites it, even if they only recite one letter or even one line of the text, or even the name of the text, can realize the whole teaching. Nichiren, borrowing from esoteric mantra practice and Pure Land Ninbutsu practice, championed the practice of chanting the title of the text as a way of invoking that core teaching and its power. Thus, the phrase Namu Myoho Renge Kyo translates to something like praise be to the profound and subtle teaching of the Lotus Sutra. I mentioned ancestor worship or veneration before, and I want to come back to that as well. This is a super common practice among Japanese new religious movements, and there are a few reasons for that. One is that it's very deeply embedded into Japanese culture and religion. Buddhism and Shinto both do it, and all of Japanese society does something like it, even if it's as simple as lighting incense in front of a picture of deceased loved ones at home. In Japan, after-death memorial services are very frequent and involved. When somebody passes away, there are usually daily memorial services for the first 7 days after death, and then there are sometimes several more services within the first 49 days after, or just on the 7th, 49th, and 100th day, depending on the local custom and the wishes of the deceased and their family. Additionally, after that, there is a memorial service during the Obon festival, which happens on the 7th or 8th month of the year, depending on where you are, and its purpose is to honor the dead. The festival may be held in the first year after the person's death, sometimes in the 3rd and 5th and 7th and 13th years, and a number of times afterwards, up to either the 39th or the 50th year. This is all a very complicated way of saying how many times people celebrate or memorialize their deceased loved ones at the Obon festival after they die. This applies for parents, grandparents, essentially anybody that has passed away in the family. The local monk at my temple that I go to has traveled to do 25 and 33-year memorials where there was nobody alive at the memorial who was alive at the same time as the deceased. That means that everybody who was attending that memorial had been born after the deceased person had died, but they still carried on the tradition of the memorial services. This heavy emphasis on ancestor worship and veneration goes back to Chinese culture, which is heavily influenced by Confucianism and Chinese folk religions. These emphasize veneration of one's parents and ancestors very strongly. This is because when these people pass away, they are said to enter into a spirit realm which is identical to ours and is just beyond sight. Once there, they need propitiation and veneration to maintain the order of heaven, which in turn maintains the order of the world of the living. Similarly, it is understood that all of our bodies and all of the world around us is a gift given to us by those who came before and have now passed away, and all of that is deserving of respect and veneration to maintain the social order of the world of the living, as well as the heavenly order of the world of the dead. Since this practice is so widespread in Japanese culture, new religious movements adopt it as a means of embedding themselves into everyday routines and as a means of appealing to people's everyday religious concerns, such as the fates of our loved ones after they've died and entered the afterlife. This potentially makes room for new religious movements to begin to gain traction for concerning, harmful, or manipulative agendas, as is the case with some of the notable Buddhist cults that we've talked about before. Whether or not Risshō Kōsei Kai is a cult is open to interpretation. We have spoken on how there's a continuum, or a spectrum, of definitions of the word cult. On the wider end of the spectrum, all religions everywhere, all throughout time, are cults. And on the narrow end of the spectrum, only small groups centered around highly charismatic founding figures with cultures of financial, physical, mental, social, and/or verbal abuse are cults. For Risshō Kōsei Kai, there is no recorded evil charismatic figure who is the object of worship. Nikkyo Niwano is not seen as a messianic figure, and he didn't have near absolute control over members' lives when he was still alive, and the current president doesn't either. Moreover, there is no documented physical, mental, financial, or verbal abuse in the group. There's not a culture of thought control. So, in my view, it doesn't really count as a cult as much as other new religious movements in Japan do, such as Happy Science,
Having participated in a culty group from the inside before, I would agree. Cult is a term with enough completely justified taboo behind it that using it for groups that haven't earned it is uncalled for. While I see the potential for cultish ideas to grow from these doctrines, it seems like this group has avoided said potential, at least on the public-facing and organizational level. So, no, this is not a cult, I think. So, what are the historical origins of Risshō Kōsei Kai's and other Japanese new religious movements?
Having discussed Risshō Kōsei Kai in great detail, I want to speak a little bit about new religious movements in Japan in general. Previously, we've covered movements such as Shinrikyo, Happy Science, and Soka Gakkai, but I think that it would be useful to step back and speak about why new religious movements started proliferating like crazy in the 19th and 20th centuries in Japan. It all starts during the 1860s, and during this time Japan underwent radical social changes. This was the end of the Edo period, which we've discussed at length as being marked by an increasing distaste for Buddhism and an increasing proclivity and concern for state-oriented Shinto, for Japanese ethnocentrism, and for commercialism. There was an underlying social tension that was growing and rising to the surface between pro-empire sentiment of state-oriented Shinto and the military government established by the shoguns. It was between the cultural and intellectual holdovers from pre-modern Japan, which were seen to be antiquated and no longer suited to the times, with the image the Japanese had of themselves being poetic, sensitive to nature, and unique compared to every other culture on Earth. It was between cosmopolitanism, inclusivity, and isolationism and insularity. It was friction between what the Japanese thought they knew about the world before and then after interactions with the Europeans, which introduced early modern science, Christianity, capitalism, imperialism, and so on. This tension led to the birth of some of modern Japan's earliest new religious movements, including Tenrikyo, Kurozumikyo, Omotokyo, and others. These movements sought to reconcile these differences in some way. For example, Tenrikyo was highly influenced by Buddhism, but still presented itself as a modern and cosmopolitan alternative, appealing to those who saw Buddhism as archaic and obsolete. Furthermore, Tenrikyo was an entirely Japanese religion, which carried over very many Shinto elements. This appealed to nativists and pro-imperial Shinto people of the time as well. It was, and still is, very common for these NRMs to borrow elements from all of these various sources, even as they sought to identify themselves as something entirely new and different from any existing religion. For example, Tenrikyo asserts the belief in a single creator god, but it still carries over ancestor worship rituals and enshrinement of kami or bodhisattvas to stay familiar to Japanese people, even as the written doctrine is something entirely else. So, the social tensions I mentioned earlier boiled over in the 1860s, leading over to the overthrow of the shogun and the reinstatement of the emperor to the highest level of political and social authority in Japan. This marked the beginning of the Meiji period of Japanese history, when anti-Buddhist and pro-Shinto sentiment was at its highest level. Buddhist institutions began to truly face persecutions in Japanese society. Sacred spaces were destroyed, monks were forced to unrenounce and re-enter lay society, and Buddhist institutions were financially starved. This is something we've covered in a few episodes, such as 85 and our research episode on Kobayashi Isa. Buddhist ecumenical leaders at the time faced an ultimatum: adapt and change, or be left behind in history or trampled by the march of progress and change. Many adapted by becoming extremely pro-emperor and pro-empire. This is one of the most common means by which these institutions survive to the present day. Zen and others, for example, made it through these societal changes by totally reshaping their doctrines and practices towards supporting the emperor and the Shinto narrative of the emperor as being a living god. Others survived by repackaging themselves into new religious movements, either deliberately or otherwise. So, NRMs arise as alternatives to older, more traditional, and stricter religious organizations. By contrast, they are modern, commodifiable, commercializable, and suited to cosmopolitan sensibilities. They are made by and for people who have religious needs, such as answers to the nature and purpose of existence and what happens to us when we die, but who think that the answers they find in older established religions like Buddhism are unsatisfactory, anachronistic, or otherwise unsuited to their everyday lives. Buddhism represented far older and more socially conservative worldviews, and people wanted spiritual needs to be met, but also wanted their everyday experiences to be validated. Furthermore, they wanted to present an image of themselves to the West and to the rest of the world as not being weighed down by superstitious and archaic doctrines. Thus, we see the rise of these movements all across the late 19th and 20th centuries.
What are some of Risshō Kōsei Kai's recent activities? Who are some of its notable figures?
Most of what they do now is humanitarian aid, charitable work, interreligious and interfaith dialogue, and political campaigning and endorsements. For example, they regularly act in conjunction with the UN to dispense aid and relief when there are disasters, or when there's UN deployments all over the world. In 2018, for example, the president of the organization, Nichiko Niwano, who is the son of the founder, met with religious leaders in Myanmar to advocate for an end to the military regime and to usher in peace for the country. Before that, they offered aid and relief efforts and volunteer efforts after the 3/11 Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. Additionally, they release periodical memos and press releases and other publications that critique or endorse Japanese and international political events. They have come out against Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's genocide of Palestinians, and they've initiated various charitable and relief efforts to support and aid Palestinians and Ukrainians affected by these wars. There are no highly notable members of the organization right now that I know of besides the son and the daughter of the founder Nikkyo Niwano. The son, who I already mentioned, is the president, and his name is Nichiko Niwano, and the daughter is the vice president, and her name is Kosho Niwano. The organization itself is actually slowly losing membership. They had 6.3 million members in 1990, and then they had 3.2 million in 2012, and they will likely have lost even more by now. Plus, they do not market themselves in a very large way or strong way to Americans the same way that Soka Gakkai International does. You'll remember that many American celebrities like Herbie Hancock, Orlando Bloom, Wayne Shorter, and many others are active members of Soka Gakkai International. There are American branches and offices of Risshō Kōsei Kai, for example in New York and Los Angeles, but they're still mostly populated by Japanese migrant communities.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Risshō Kōsei Kai. Join us next week where we'll be discussing sex in Buddhism. How ought we understand sex in Buddhism? What is the meaning and significance of the doctrine prohibiting sexual indiscretion? How have understandings of this doctrine changed over time? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Hi, Nick here. I just wanted to give a big thanks to Tanner, our first patron on Patreon. Just a reminder, if you would like to join him, you can find us at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for backing us, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.